Being offended is now an industry. A campaigner has convinced Marks and Spencer's to rename their iconic soft jelly sweets, which for decades have been known as midget gems. Here they are. Fabulous things. I've grown up on them and have the fillings to prove it. Now, the term midget to describe someone with dwarfism is inaccurate and offensive to many. It's certainly not a word I would use, and it's widely accepted that you just don't use that term to describe someone with dwarfism. But where does this end? Isn't the word dwarfism offensive in itself? After all, the word dwarfism, or dwarf, connotes images of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Grumpy, sneezy, sleepy. Perhaps there should be an eighth dwarf added to the list. Mr. Permanently Offended. There are many terms previously not considered offensive, which we now generally don't use. And that's how language works. It evolves not through the edict or the iron fist of corporate messaging, but it evolves through a social understanding of which terms to use and which not. We don't need a manual. We don't need rules. In the comedy drama series Minder, the lead character, Arthur Daly's wife, was known as Indoors. That's right. His wife was known as Indoors, right? Never seen on the show. Now, at that time, this was a harmless characterization of a put-upon and invisible wife. Indoors was a long-suffering spouse trapped in a holy matrimony with a professional con man and more or less chained to the kitchen sink. Indoors was a term that you could argue was basically social satire about what marriage was like at that time. Just as Les Dawson did so many mother-in-law jokes, largely because in the 60s and 70s, so many generations of families lived under one roof. Men lived with their mother-in-law, hence all of the jokes. But times change. Multi-generational households are less commonplace, and we don't really have mother-in-law jokes anymore. My own mother-in-law is beyond reproach by the way. She's perfect. Plus, she might be watching this, so I better watch my back. But this is all about perspective and focusing on the important issues. There is now an obsession with micromanaging our language to fit a social and political agenda. Whether it's Scottish civil servants being ordered to declare their gender pronouns in all emails, or a campaign to change the name of an iconic Scottish pub called the Black Bitch, which I hasten to add is named after a female dog. If your twisted worldview and overactive imagination can read into that racism, then perhaps that racism lies within you. Someone who sees racism in places where it is not contains within them the very seeds of intolerance of which they accuse others. Keeping the name midget gems for these fellas, that's not a hill to die on. If it upsets members of our fantastic dwarfism community, some of whom I've had the privilege of interviewing for my Channel 4 documentary series, then fair enough. If it's offensive, let's stop using the word. The challenges that this community face are unique, and I was humbled to make that show. But where this campaigner overplays her hand is to call the naming of jelly beans hate speech. Seriously, is the name of a bag of wine gums, which has been in circulation for decades, really hate speech? As with so many of these politically charged campaigns, it does a disservice to real hate speech and real intolerance. In recent years, we've seen a rewriting of our history, and now we are witnessing the rewriting of our very language. An attempt is being made by activists to literally decide the words we use and the words we don't use. Language, especially a great iconic one such as English, should grow, not shrink. And it's in the gift of generation after generation to decide which terms should enter the vernacular and which can slowly ebb away. But that is an organic and democratic process. To rig our language, to prescribe it, to start Tipexing out words from one day to another is the stuff of George Orwell's worst nightmare. Language matters because words shape thought. And to have good discourse and to be the most democratic and reflective society we can be, we need the widest possible choice of words at our disposal. Language should be like the internet. It's all out there. The good, the bad, and the indifferent. And yes, the ugly. And it's in the gift of every sovereign human being to select their chosen words. Because if you decide what words people use, you're actually shaping their thoughts. In the end, You're telling people what to think. You're bullying them and potentially brainwashing them. You could argue we've seen plenty of that in the pandemic. Living in a society where you're afraid what to do, what to say, or even what to think is where we are dangerously headed, in my view. And it's the definition of what hateful really looks like. Let me offer you 3 quotes. 3 philosophers. Oliver Wendell Holmes once said, "Language is the blood of the soul, into which thoughts run and out of which they grow." Rita Mae Brown said, "Language is the roadmap of a culture. It tells you where its people come from and where they're going." And Wittgenstein, easy for you to say, I'll put my teeth back in, the philosopher Wittgenstein said, "The limits on your language are the limits on your world." He took the words right out of my mouth. Now, whatever you say about these little mini gems, whether you call them mini gems or mini goblins, mini sweets, mini chews, they're delicious.